Tonight, I come here to pay tribute to our late Cheikh Anta Diop, who died in February of this year. Cheikh Anta Diop was the greatest living African, at least in terms of the reconstruction of our history. No one who has lived in this century or before of African descent has made such a major contribution to the reconstruction of African history. I first became aware of Cheikh Anta Diop, as most African Americans did, through the translated work on African origin of civilization, myth or reality, which was translated. It's a combination of things. In fact, it's two works, excerpts from two works translated by Mercer Cook, which was published by Lawrence Hill in this country. Unfortunately, I only became aware of him when I had completed They Came Before Columbus. I had just come to the conclusion of my book when I became aware of Cheikh Anta Diop. Cheikh Anta Diop was to leave an impact upon the minds of all the people who had read him. He was the subject of tremendous attacks in France and in various parts of the world. And one of the most astonishing things is that although at the first World Festival of Negro Art, he was given, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, the award for the greatest scholar, black scholar, who has exerted the greatest influence on the minds of blacks in the 20th century. There was actually a conference in Dakar, just 300 yards from his laboratory, by Africanists, mostly European, and he was not invited. He, the greatest of all the Africanists, was not invited to an Africanist conference that was being held in his own country. You become aware through a study of Diop's life not only of great issues that affect the history of African peoples, but you also become aware of the tragedy of the modern world. Because Diop had his foot in many worlds. He was a great physicist and chemist. He was a great linguist. He was a great historian, of course, particularly Egyptologist. And above all, he was a great politician. Few people are aware of what he did in terms of his own country, how he was imprisoned. He founded 3 political parties, and in fact, he was to become, as the leader of the opposition, he was most likely to become the next president of Senegal. So I shall speak of many aspects of his life. I must first speak of meeting him, because although I knew of his work and we had corresponded for about 9 or 10 years, I did not meet him until 1985. I did not meet him until January of 1985. That's one of the curious things about me. I am so busy that unless I meet someone at the lecture, I hardly ever meet them at all. There are many of my colleagues at Rutgers. I've been there 16 years. I have never met them. I know their names. I've heard them on the telephone, but I've never seen them. I remember Ronald Christ, for example, who edited a magazine, Inter-American Review, and I subscribed to that magazine. I wrote articles. He wrote me letters. I talked with him on the telephone. I have never yet seen him in my life. And Cheikh Anta Diop, for whom I had a special affection, wrote me several times and I wrote him back. We had long correspondence, but I never saw him. And not until last January in England did I meet him. And I met him under the most unusual circumstances, because I had lived in England for many years. I had lived in England for 10.5 years. Only one of those years was spent in Africa, and part of it also was spent in Eastern Europe, but I kept coming back to London. But when I had spoken in London before, people were aware of me only as a literary figure, a writer of novels. I had written a book which was made into film, a television film called The Black Prince, and people knew me as a literary critic. I had sat on the Nobel Committee, at least when I came to America, I sat on the Nobel Committee based upon the work I had done as a literary person, but nobody knew of anything that I was thinking in terms of the black world. because that was not something that one talked very much about in England. People weren't even aware that they were black. In the sense of community, in the sense of having a shared experience with the rest of the world, in the sense of being able to operate as a world force to change not only the consciousness of man, but to change the circumstances in the world. There was only one issue that got to the root of every one of us. That was South Africa. And that issue, in fact, nearly led to my expulsion from university, because I never spoke. For 10 years, I kept quiet. I never said a word about anything political. And the only time I opened my lips was on South Africa. And this was conveyed back to the authorities. And the arrangement was that I should be expelled from the university. I don't want to go into that now. If I were questioned about it at question time, I will come to that matter. But the reason why I raise it is because I'm very much aware from a study of Diop's life that Diop, like myself, was deeply involved in politics. It is impossible to become involved in black history without becoming involved in politics. Because to reconstruct the history of black people anywhere in the world, you have to fight against a climate of great prejudice. Diop discovered that Diop could have had an easy route, because Diop was very fortunate. At the age of 22, he had his bachelor's. There was at least a university in Dakar. There was no university in my country. I did not get my first degree, my BA. I did not get my BA until I was 32. He got it when he was 22, which is normal. That's what you get here. There was no university in my country. So he had his career all set out. He was a brilliant young man. He was born in 1923. He died at the age of 61. He was born on December the 23rd, 1923 in Diourbel in western Senegal. He was a Muslim. He attended Quranic schools. His family was Muslim. He belonged to the sect of the Murids, one of the most independent Muslim sects that you can find anywhere in Africa. And he went out to Paris in 1946 to further his studies. But he was a proud, stubborn, independent mind. He could have got anywhere he wanted to go. With a scholarship to Paris, a French African could go anywhere in the world. He could even end up as a minister in the parliament. The British never allowed that. None of us were ever allowed to become head of anything until we became independent. None of us. That is one of the things when I was growing up. I remember when I was about 20, I entered the civil service. About 19, I entered the civil service in Guyana. The first thing I heard, I was at the meeting with the director of the audit department. They put me in the audit department, and he sat down before all the Asians and Africans and other people, and he said to them quite nakedly, "You can aspire to any position in this department except my own." Because only heads of departments could only be filled by Englishmen. And one of the things you noted in that country, it didn't matter what an Englishman did, he never went to jail. There was no Englishman who ever went to jail. They disappeared, meaning they put them on a ship and sent them back home quietly. But they never went to prison. No Englishman ever did a menial task. That is why many West Indians, when we went to England and we saw white porters lifting things, people nearly died from shock. They'd never seen a white man lift an object before. Everything was done for them. Now in the French world, in spite of the prejudice, the great prejudice, there were certain distinctions made that were not always made purely on color but on class. So that someone who was highly educated, who was very French in culture, could get right up to the position of minister in the government. Therefore you find people like Aimé Césaire from Martinique, French Martinique, Léon Damas from French Guyana, Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal. All of these are men who eventually sat in the Parliament of France. Diop therefore had an opportunity to become anything he wanted to become, but he was too proud and stubborn to become a colonial. He therefore immediately set out on a very serious task, a very bold and courageous task. He set out to do his doctorate on Egypt and to challenge, for the first time in a scientific way, more than anyone had challenged before outside of Gerald Massey, who was white, but no African, no black historian had ever, with such skill, such expertise, such a range of disciplines, challenged all that conservatives had said about Egypt. And he went straight into the mouth of the cannon. And of course the university rejected it. They said this is unfounded, because he tried to show that Egypt created the first major civilization, and that Greece, the fountainhead of European civilization, fed upon the Egyptian, which was the quintessence of the African civilization. And that Egypt was not possible without what came out of Ethiopia, which was not possible without what came from the interior cradle land of Africa. And he therefore deeply challenged all that had been taught for centuries, and this was rejected. Diop did not give up. Diop spent years trying to get his doctorate. He came back again and again. On the third time, he came with a battery of scholars, and he came with massive evidence and supporting professors. And they were forced to give him his doctorate. They were shamed into giving him his doctorate. He was not just a historian, he was a scientist. Diop came first in mathematics in his school, and he entered one of the most advanced laboratories in France. Many of you may have heard of Mario and Giulio Curie, who won the prize, the Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of radium. Their son-in-law, Giulio Curie, he founded a laboratory, the most advanced laboratory in France, and Diop worked in that laboratory. Diop was therefore open to the most advanced scientific knowledge available. He was so developed that at a time when only a few people in the world understood Einstein's relativity theory, Diop translated major sections of that theory into Wolof, his own language. That startled a lot of people. And that knowledge, that scientific knowledge of physics, there was also a knowledge of chemistry. Diop developed a special process known as the melanin dosage test, whereby he could tell by test going into the skin of dead mummies, African kings and pharaohs who have been buried thousands of years. He could take off square inches of that skin and test it in the laboratory and establish that the level of melanin in that skin proved that they were black people, that they were African. He was able to do that with the Mariette excavations. He was able to show that all of those mummies were of African descent. And when he established this, he asked permission to get square inches of skin from other mummies in Cairo Museum. No, sir, you're not touching our mummies. They're mummies, and they have absolutely no relationship by blood or history to those mummies. Yeah. Because the modern Egyptian is as much Egyptian as the modern American is American. There are no Americans practically in this room. We are Africans, or there may be a European here or there, or an Asian. But we are not native to this place. So that many Egyptians are not native to Egypt at all. Many of them have no claim whatsoever to those pyramids and those mummies and the marvels of early Egyptian science and philosophy. When Sadat was here a few years ago, Sadat said, "I am a black man, and I'm the first true pharaoh in 2,000 years. What Sadat was saying, I'm not like them. I am for real. I am truly Egyptian. My mother is Sudanic. Many of them are not there. when I come to deal with the Cairo conference in 1974, you will find that the most reactionary of the delegates to the UNESCO conference were the Egyptians. Let me tell you about that conference. Let me read you my report on that conference in the introduction to this new Diop book. I have to point out that the Diop book does not come out until July the 7th, but I urge you to subscribe to it now, so that as soon as it comes out, I could send you a copy of the book. It is 400 pages. We have never attempted anything like that. It is delayed because we never knew that the material would pile up to a point whereby it would become almost twice as large as most of our journals. It's larger than African Presence in Europe. It's more than 100 and something pages larger than Blacks in Science. So it is the most ambitious thing that we have attempted. And now in France, strangely enough, here we are in the English-speaking country, and we've already done a tribute to Diop, the greatest of African scientists and thinkers. And now France has become aware of my work, and they're writing letters asking me to send an article to be published in their tribute to Diop. Their tribute to Diop may not come out this year at all, because they're not ready. It's a strange thing. A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. Diop went to this conference on the peopling of ancient Egypt. Now I want you to listen to this very carefully. After many years, more than 2 centuries in which European universities and academics have stated that Egypt is Caucasoid, or it is Semitic or Hamitic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic, eventually they invited Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga. This is the first time at any international conference on an intellectual matter that Africans are invited up to deal with their own story. Theophile Obenga, he wrote me last week. This is the first time I'm hearing from him, because apparently Diop left a lot of papers after he died, and so several people in France and French-speaking Africa suddenly become aware of the journal for the first time. Theophile Obenga is an expert on Bantu. He's head of the Bantu Research Institute in Brazzaville. He's a great linguist, like Diop. And they appeared at this conference. Everybody else was European or Arab from the Arab Republic of Egypt. And at this conference, everybody came unprepared except the 2 Africans. Could you imagine that? This is a conference meeting, an academic conference meeting to discuss the peopling of Egypt, and these guys arrive empty-handed, talking from their heads. The Africans arrive with heavily researched papers. The linguistic evidence of Diop was so startling that everyone had to admit this is one of the revolutionary things, that Diop and Obenga, particularly Diop, had proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Egyptian language was not Semitic or Hamitic, it was African. But there is where the agreement ended, because when Diop tried to show that not only the language was African, but that the people were African, everybody got upset. And those people who couldn't say that it is not so, they said, we mustn't talk about race anymore. We are all human beings here. Let's stop talking about race. So let me read you the passage from my introduction which deals with this. A summary of this conference is of interest and value to readers, since it reveals the state of Egyptology at the moment and the defensive reaction to the question of blackness or Negroness. Professor Galab of the Arab Republic of Egypt declared that the human race during the Paleolithic era, which is the Stone Age, was more or less homogeneous and Caucasian, meaning to say all human beings were first white. This is an Egyptian, you know. And that Negroes only began to appear much later. A Negro culture, he claimed, did not appear prior to the Neolithic, that is the age of agriculture. Professor Di Bono of Malta spoke of a race of pyramid builders coming into Egypt, a race with Libico-Asiatic affinities, without even deeming it necessary to show where on this earth stands the proto-pyramid that this race constructed before it migrated to Africa. How could you have a race of pyramid builders who never built pyramids anywhere else? Several participants, finding it difficult to demolish Diop, decided instead to demolish all talk about race. Professor Saf Soderberg of Sweden, while demonstrating that the majority of Neolithic cultures in the Nile Valley belong to techno-complex of Saharan and Sudanic cultures, said the concept of race was outmoded and should now be abandoned. After he showed that the technology of the early Egyptians is Sudanic and Saharan, which is African, he said, don't talk about race. Race is outmoded, must be abandoned. Professor Vorkuta of France, insisting that there was no way to tell how many of the Egyptians were white and how many were black, felt the evidence nevertheless showed that Egypt at least was African in its way of writing, its culture, and its way of thinking. Now just imagine that. You can't tell how many white people are there, yet everything they're doing is African. In other words, they're white Africans. These white Africans, their language, they said, is African. Their culture is African. Their science is African. And yet you can't tell whether they're white or black. Professor Shinny of Canada said that Herodotus and all the Greeks and Romans who had called Egyptians black were merely being subjective like Dr. Diop. Race was not a scientific concept. Professor Mokhtar of the Arab Republic of Egypt said the problem of race was unimportant. Professor Abdullah of the Sudan, after chiding Diop for adopting an Africanist approach to this problem, went on boldly to assert that the Egyptian language belonged to a family of Proto-Semitic languages and that there was abundant evidence to prove it. He had not come to the conference, however, with his abundant evidence. This, in fact, was one of the remarkable revelations of this international conference. In its final report, UNESCO pointed out, quote, listen to this, although the preparatory working paper set out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications comparable with the painstakingly researched contributions of Professor Cheikh Anta Diop and Ubenga. The Africans at last had done their homework, and those theses, which had once seemed formidable, now shook with the fragility of leaves in the new intellectual wind blowing from the continent. All the time they had had their own way until they had become intellectually flabby. This is one of the things that I have noted. When I was in Arizona some years ago, I had to fight with someone they called an expert on Mexico. And when I opened up on this guy, I realized that I wasn't fighting an equal, that he couldn't fight because he'd never fought in his life. We have to fight. We have to fight for every inch of ground. Nothing is yielded to us without a struggle. But they always took it for granted. As my mother used to say, they're born with golden spoons in their mouths. And so when at last he met a fighter, he couldn't fight. When I started on him, I suddenly realized, I said, you know, animals when they fight like apes, etc., when they're about to overpower you completely and they realize that you are losing, the ape pulls back. Man doesn't usually pull back. And there is something Christian in me which said, you know, you've got him on the ground now, let him go. And there's something devilish in me that said, let him go, my foot. He has trampled us for centuries. These are the kinds of men who have destroyed us for centuries. They are still destroying us. Our children are being destroyed. Don't let him go. The time has come to kick these people. Amen. When the knowledge arises, there is no compromise here because we are dealing with something savage and brutal. It is something that is cruel. It comes on the smiles. It comes on the smiles, etc. And everyone is so sweet and kind and nice. But there are people being destroyed in every aspect of our life. People are being destroyed. You cannot look at some of our children today. You cannot go into those universities to teach without realizing that somebody has taken a gun and shot out a piece of their brains. You have to rebuild the whole world You have to rebuild the whole intellect now in order just to get a few facts through. How can one be soft about something like that? How can one stand before something that is so painful, so absolute, so pervasive, so overwhelming, so destructive, and not feel an anger so great that when the time comes, one wants to shoot them all? Because when Diop told me about South Africa, do you know South Africa has an atomic bomb? And do you know how they got it? They have the finest atomic bomb. When you read the book I have brought out, Great African Thinkers, read the section where Diop talks in South Africa, and he's a physicist, he knows about uranium in detail. Read how they got their bomb. And one of our satellites spinning around this planet a few years ago saw a flash, an atomic flash out of South Africa. It was all covered up. I don't want to give you, I prefer you to read the section that deals with South Africa and the atomic bomb and where they got their plutonium from and where they got their expertise from. It is something frightening. And you have to read these things because Diop wasn't just a historian. Diop related himself to the modern world. He knew as a politician who had suffered in prison that unless these ideas can be related to our present lives, they will be lost. People have to know the relevance and urgency of this kind of information. I had a long correspondence with him once about the discovery in the body of Ramesses II of tobacco. This is something that stunned the world. Ramesses II was a great pharaoh who had been lying in state in the museum in Egypt for many centuries. Suddenly he developed, or over a period of time, he developed an infection in the leg. You can understand how extraordinary the African mummification must be, that it took thousands of years for him to develop an infection in his leg. This infection was eating away the mummy. They got afraid, and since France is in control of most of these things, France, many Parisian laboratories came to study the mummy of Ramesses II. He was taken over to Paris. Diop said when they took off the cover, he saw Ramesses II. Ramesses II was very black. When they brought him back home, he was pale. They put so much gamma rays in that mummy that they turned him pale. Diop said in spite of all of that, it would still be possible to test him, to give him the melanin dosage test. But some strange thing happened. And I unwittingly had something to do with it because Diop wrote me and says, they have found tobacco in the belly of Ramesses II. And he said to me in a letter which is published in this new journal, that proves that you are right. Not only the Egyptians come to America, but they came back bringing the tobacco. And I wrote him and says, no. Here you are likely to be making a mistake because even though people have argued for centuries that tobacco is American, it is not. I have shown in my book, which at that time, he was writing in 1980. My book did not come out in France until 1981. So he had only read pieces of my book. He had not read the French edition of the book. And I said, when the French edition comes out, you are to look very closely at the chapter on tobacco because I have shown that tobacco is not American. There is an African tobacco and there's an American tobacco. And that in fact the word tobacco comes from tobak, which comes from dubak, which is a Syrian word for viscum, glue, and the viscosity of the tobacco plant led the Syrians to call it dubak, and then it was changed to tubak, and it led to words like tuba, taba, tawa, tama, and that is what came over, so that the Americans started to call not the tobacco plant, for which they had a name since they had a tobacco plant, they called the pipe tobacco. And they called the act of smoking with the mouth, which was new to them, tobacco. so that could be an African tobacco. So use your laboratory, because Diop was the founder and maker of the radiocarbon laboratory in Dakar. Since his death, I think it was last month, the government of Senegal decided to call it the Cheikh Anta Diop Institute rather than the radiocarbon laboratory. It is now named after him. But he could not do this because nobody would allow him to touch the tobacco. But nevertheless, he informed people in Egypt and in France that I had raised the question that they should test the tobacco to see if indeed it is like American tobacco. Do you know, after the test was performed, everybody got quiet? There were 8 laboratories involved, and none of them published reports. And do you know what they said? They stopped studying Ramesses II, and then the rumor went around that they got the wrong mummy. In other words, either they discovered that that was an African tobacco, not like the American, which means it upset all the arguments, or they discovered it was American, which meant that there's a possibility that the Egyptians brought it back from America in an early time, which upset them even more. So either way, they got caught, so they shut up. That was the end of the matter. We never heard again about Ramesses II. Nothing has been published about it. How can you deal with that kind of duplicity? How can you deal with that conspiracy of silence without feeling a great anger? And you could see why a man like Diop would eventually be led into serious politics. Because when you become aware of all of those things, you begin to realize that history is a political fight. Because these guys are prepared to go to any lengths to cloud over what has happened in our lives, because they know that that knowledge can give you a consciousness so powerful that it could upset the world. Look, don't make any mistake about it. Consciousness is the key to power. A different kind of consciousness is the key to power. Even in spite of all their guns and everything, that fight that is going on in South Africa, where children are throwing themselves at the guns because of a different consciousness. 20 years ago, they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have done that. So that it is with a different kind of consciousness that true revolution begins, because people are prepared to take this thing to a point where you can no longer fool anybody. If those Africans like Diop and Obenga were not alive, if that kind of complexity and sophistication of intellect did not exist, that UNESCO conference would have done the same damn thing they've been doing for centuries. It wouldn't have shifted a bit. Surely the Egyptians wouldn't have shifted it. It was through me and Diop that the Egyptians asked the British back for the splinters of the Sphinx's nose. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't dare think of that. So colonial Mokhtar, this man at UNESCO, forced me to write almost an apologetic note in my journal saying that I have been given permission to print this essay by Diop, but not all the participants of the conference at the conference agreed with it. How could they all agree with it when it stands in contradiction with all the lies that they have been preaching? And Diop's special scientific knowledge, not only his knowledge of linguistics, his knowledge of physics led him to question something very seriously. There's an article in this new book called Iron Metallurgy in the Ancient Egyptian Empire. Several French investigators said that although they found iron, listen to this, smelted iron was found in Egypt in the Great Pyramid, a niche in the Great Pyramid. And they said, well, it is an accident. It fell from a higher strata, meaning a later period, because the Egyptians couldn't have smelted iron, they said. And they said it was decarbonized iron, soft iron. Diop showed, because of his scientific knowledge, that soft iron is more advanced than hard iron, because you have to take the carbon out of it to get to that stage. And iron smelting advances and advances until it gets less and less carbon. So that this kind of carbon they found, stratum iron, is advanced iron. And then he showed that it couldn't have fallen from a higher strata because the people who found it went to great extent to establish that it was an untroubled strata or level in the pyramid, that nobody had touched that when they found it. So all these things were cover-ups and lies. And then he showed that King Tut's bed, the posts of King Tut's bed were made out of smelted iron. When he went in the Cairo Museum and he pointed out to the curator, he says, "This is iron, isn't it?" And the curator said, "Yes." He says, Diop said, "Well, could you write me a note saying that it is iron?" "Not me. No, sir. They're not going to write any such note. They'll lose their job." And when he showed that the Eye of Horus was made of smelted iron, so that it's not only in the Great Pyramid, but periods long before the smelting of iron, you have objects of real iron, not meteoric iron which falls from the sky, but iron done through the smelting process. And he showed with great persuasiveness, based on his scientific knowledge, that this was so. Now years passed before I met Diop, and I want to read to you the beginning of this introduction to the book, because this describes how I felt when I met Diop, and it also says something about his death. I felt a strange sense of awe in his presence. It was the aura of nobility and graciousness, perhaps, the quiet air of intellectual authority, the legend of his life and his work that had preceded him. His eyes never left me as he spoke, but though his gaze and his grip were firm, his voice was surprisingly soft. The sibilances of his French rose and fell upon my brain like waves of whispers. "Monsieur Diop," was all I could say. "We meet at last." It was a cool blue London day, the light of a premature springtime loitering like a stranger on the streets of a winter morn. January 13, 1985, about a year and a month before his death. We had exchanged long letters. We had spoken on occasion on the telephone. I had read his work in English, he my work in French. He had followed avidly the issues of the Journal of African Civilizations. Yet nearly a decade was to pass before we met face to face. That week in London, we talked to packed houses. We dined, we discoursed, we debated. Diop's great friend of many years, Carlos Moore, made us feel at times as though we were conversing in the same language. But in spite of the growing familiarity, my sense of awe and reverence in his presence persisted. I saw him more as a father than as a comrade in arms. I felt the long road that I would still have to walk. I could not shake off the impression of being in the shadow of an elder spirit. It is not for us to say that the death of a man comes too early or too late. Fate is far too complex. But let us venture to say that we in America needed a guide and a teacher like Diop. Africa, above all, needed a leader like Diop. Had he lived to become president of Senegal, he might have piloted some of the nations of West Africa into the first stages of a federated state. His passing, therefore, is a very great blow to us all. Yet history teaches us that men like these do not die at the time of their deaths. Often it is that the fall of a great teacher or prophet is the beginning of the rise of his ideas. So let it be with Diop. Now, I want to say something about his work as a politician, his ideas about modern Africa, before I come back to deal with his historical theses. Now, Diop was very determined to change Africa. He was deeply depressed by the state of modern Africa. He was well aware that Africa is only in the first stage of its independence. Lots of us are very unhappy about the state of modern Africa. We have seen tremendous disasters occur in Africa, in Uganda with Idi Amin, in the Congo with Lumumba, in South Africa, of course, that is the darkest, the most terrifying chapter of African history. But in many parts of Africa, apart from the imperialist thing, apart from the colonial thing, we find that the many centuries of colonization has created corruption among many of the ruling elite in Africa. Many of the Africans who've gone to British universities or French universities have come back without a sense of what they are, without a sense of what the continent of Africa is, without a sense of true history. Diop is unusual in that respect, like Nkrumah. They have a real sense of what it was to have been an African, what the very finest, what is the finest that occurred not only in Egypt but other parts of Africa, like among the Dogon, for example, where the excellence, the quintessence of the African spirit survived. This is something we can go back to. This is nothing that is past and dead. This is a model. And Diop was very concerned about that instead of having this fighting between little mini states, you can have federated structures. You can't federate all Africa, but you could have certain nations coming together in a certain working structure, because therein lies the great strength. We tried to do that in the Caribbean. We did not succeed. And so, it went all haywire. Diop wanted very much to do that in Africa, as Nkrumah did. But he knew that it could not be done unless they developed certain things. You had to have a sense of the cultural integrity of the African people. What did they belong to? Where this unity and continuity lay, so that you don't just see yourself as Nigerians and Ghanaians, etc. But above and beyond that, you see what Africa is, what it is to be African. He found that a certain re-education had to begin. He was the man, and he didn't just talk about this. Diop actually founded the first World Black Researchers Association, in which he was to bring scientists from all over Africa and other parts of the black world, so to make sure that whatever was being developed, that technology transfer would occur. It would be carried into Africa. Let me tell you, in spite of all this fight between Russia and America, America gives technology to Russia. America gives technology to China. They buy it. America gives all of its military technology to Israel. And Israel gives some of it to South Africa. So how come the Africans, Diop is one of the few blacks who was the director of a scientific institution. He actually founded and created a radiocarbon laboratory for radioactive research in Senegal, single-handedly. He was in prison because he founded a political party. They declared it illegal. They threw him in prison. That's how he did a lot of his work. He studied in prison. And when he came out of the prison, say, "You keep quiet, we're going to help you." And for a while they kept him quiet, and he built his thing. And then he founded another political party, and once again he was in trouble. When we invited him here to come to America, we had a lot of trouble. Every time in the last days, every time we pick up the telephone, a woman answers. Not related at all. The American and French intelligence became involved. We just could not communicate with Diop. When eventually Diop got on the plane took off from Dakar. 1,000 miles from Dakar, the plane began to tremble violently. They said it had a fractured wing. They had to swing around and fly all the way back to Dakar. When they landed, all the tires exploded. Well, Diop stayed home. His friends begged him, "Don't go. This is a plot in your life. Don't go." We had the Nile Valley Conference here. We were there at the airport. Even the mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, paid for the plane to come down to New York so that we could meet Diop. Diop didn't turn up. Jeffries was waiting, John Clark, myself, Finch. We didn't see Diop. And nobody believed us. Many people thought that it was just a trick, that we'd only use Diop's name to bring people to. All sorts of rumors sprang up. When Diop eventually came to America, he told what had happened. But the next time we were smarter, we never telephoned him. We never told anybody we were bringing Diop to New York. That was the best way to get rid of French intelligence or American intelligence. Nobody knew Diop was coming. Only about 5 people knew. myself, Dr. Charles Finch, the president of Morehouse, the dean of the Martin Luther King, and Andrew Young. Nobody else knew Diop was coming. We couldn't inform anyone, we couldn't take any risks, because we couldn't take any chance that intelligence would pick it up. And we made sure that Diop would fly to Paris. So Diop flew to Paris as if he was just going to meet his wife and his friends in Paris. And then we smuggled him out to Paris. We got him on Delta Airlines, and they flew him straight to Atlanta. So there was no interruption. When Diop took his flight, nobody knew. They just flew him clean out from France into the United States. We met him at the airport, and then the whole range of things began, his talks, etc. When he landed in Washington, D.C., myself and Diop had to speak before NAFIO. This is heads, black educators, heads of black schools and things like that, so forth. And even Howard, who had to provide a translator, didn't know who was coming. They were told it was a prominent Senegalese. We couldn't even tell Howard University. I don't need to say why. But Diop came here, and he was profoundly impressed by his treatment. He was treated as a head of state. Everything that could be done, we brought out the whole Atlantic police force to protect him, all the security, all the hospitality, everything. We brought Coretta King and so forth, and all the various people in the southern lead. That started a whole series of lectures. Now there are 2 or 3 main elements in the Diop lectures. One of them is the beginnings of man. Diop has argued that man, black man, African man created European man and Asiatic man. Now in my university, in various parts of the world, it has been accepted for the last 15 to 20 years that man was born in Africa. That is not in question. Nobody doubts that now. They doubted it early in this century. They looked for man in Palestine. They looked for man in Asia. They looked for man in Europe. Somebody created a fabricated skull, half monkey, half man, called Piltdown Man, and fooled them for a long time. But since Leakey's work, it is accepted throughout the world that man was born in Africa. But that didn't solve anything, because what they're saying is, okay, man was born in Africa, but then he came to Europe and got really advanced and evolved, created civilization and brought it back to that backward half-ape living in Africa. Diop showed that there were 6 stages of man, and that 3 of them never left Africa. The other 3 not only wandered all over Africa, but wandered into Europe and into Asia. In that period of time, the Straits of Gibraltar did not exist. It was possible to cross from Africa into Europe on dry land, because Europe is only 20 miles away from Africa. The northernmost part of Africa is only 20 miles from the southernmost part of Europe. Also, Asia you could have crossed because you didn't have that cutaway. You could cross. Also, you could cross easily by boats because the distance is not great. So that man then spread out from Africa and spread into Europe and spread into Asia. Now this was, while Europeans accepted this, they're saying, yes, okay, fine, he came out of Africa, but he came out at the most primitive, backward stage. His brain was not properly developed. But when he got into the ice, then he started to evolve. Okay, and so European man is a highly advanced type, but African man is a backward type. Now, strangely enough, the most ironic thing to happen in this whole story is that the day before Diop died, a battery of 11 scientists, most of them from Oxford, England, the most conservative place you could find in the world, came out with proof that not only was man born in Africa, but modern man was born in Africa. Okay, I want you to note that there's a big distinction. This is the end of the argument. Not only have they shown, as Leakey did, that man was born in Africa, that has been accepted for quite some time. It doesn't prove anything. But they have proven that the last man, the most advanced type of man, the last phase in the evolution of man, the most modern man, the man with the brain case of the European, the Asiatic, and the African, was born in Africa. Let me read that section to you. It appears in Nature, as I say, the day before Diop died. It's entitled Evolutionary Relationships of Human Populations from an Analysis of Nuclear DNA Polymorphisms. It's the work of 11 scientists, most of them from the University of Oxford, England, and it appears in Nature, Volume 3, February the 6th, 1986. The team of scientists concluded, quote, "The earliest fossils of anatomically modern man, which is known as Homo sapiens sapiens, have been found in Africa, at Omo in Ethiopia, Border Cave in South Africa, and at Classes River mouth in South Africa. The data from the last site suggests that Homo sapiens sapiens was present in South Africa more than 100,000 years ago, and an adult mandible from Border Cave has been dated about 90,000 years before the present. Hence, it has been argued that the evolution of modern man took place in Africa. Our data are consistent with such a scheme in which the founder population of the modern world migrated from Africa and subsequently gave rise to all non-African populations. In other words, it has now been established by the analysis of DNA polymorphism that the European is an African. He springs out of the African, the Asian springs out of the African. The Asian is partly Africoid and partly Caucasoid, because the Caucasoid, the Asian appears later. The Caucasoid comes out of the African. It's a shift. It probably comes from albinism, where the African gives birth to a pigmentless person. This is possible even today in Africa, though a pigmentless person does not survive in Africa. An albino only has about 25 to 30 years of life, but in the ice, an albino would survive. So that you have in the ice, about 50 to 55,000 years ago, in the ice of Europe during an ice age, a certain number of the Africans living in Europe began to undergo a change. The first change is that they retain African features, but they become albinos. The albino condition springs out of the fact that the pigmented skin, which is critical to survival in the tropics, is not critical to survival in the ice, in the extreme ice. And I'm not talking just the temperate zone. We are living now in the temperate zone. That's not ice. Okay, it has a certain amount of cold period. I'm talking about an extreme ecology in which great parts of Europe were covered by ice 1 mile thick. And the African population got into trouble because they were removed from the sun 3 times. A, the sun was no longer direct and abundant as in Africa. B, the sunlight was not only weak and tangential, but it was further removed because they had to cover their skin from the cold they had to cover their bodies from the cold in the skins of animals, which further removed them from the sun. And third, they had to live for a long time in caves. And the light of Europe, a great part of Europe, was twilight. It did not have the brightness of Africa. It was a twilight. Hence, you find a shift in terms of the melanin in the skin, which is critical to survival in the areas where man was born, in the latitudes of the tropics, that the melanocytes started to become inactive, and you have the calcification of certain things that are which feed on melanin. Like, for example, it has been pointed out by doctors recently that there is a certain part of the European that is calcified. It's the pineal gland which feeds on the melanin. Okay, so that you have shifts occurring at first, and then shifts occur not only in color of eyes, color of hair, color of skin, which is one shift. Because as soon as you lose pigmentation, eye color changes, Skin color changes, hair color changes, but then you also have contraction change. That is, the bones of the face undergo a slow shift because the nose gets narrower, because the narrow nose in the ice is natural. Okay, you have a contracted nose as against an expanded nose, so that you have movements that affect ecologies that affect the structure of the face. Now, these things have been established on a scientific basis. While it has been speculated on before, it has not been established before. Now it is clear that the European is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries, which is the opposite to what that great South African, what was his name, that great liberal South African, Schweitzer, said, the Negro is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries. It is just the opposite. Now, this doesn't establish inferiority and superiority of races. What it establishes, however, is that it is wrong to suggest that the African is late in time. He is not late, he's the elder. It is also wrong to suggest that any defects or disadvantages that may appear in black people any part of the world as a result of the sociology of their situation is not due to any biological defect, because biologically they are the original people of the world. And they're not just original in terms of being the birthplace of mankind. They are also the most advanced. That type, that is the most advanced type, that has the brain case of modern man, is African. In other words, there are pre-sapien types. There's the Neanderthal type, which also came out of Africa. We're not talking about that. That type disappeared. Some people think that some Europeans are still in the Neanderthal stage. I don't want to comment on that. But the point is that that Neanderthal type was not complete. It was missing a lobe in the brain. And that the Homo sapiens sapiens, which is the last man, he is complete. He is what we all are, regardless of our race, which is superficial, but which has become tremendously important because we are living in sociologies, we are living in a historical condition which has made it terrifyingly important. And we have lived for the last 5 centuries in a situation which make us feel as though we are the inferiors, as though we have contributed nothing to the world, as though we are the latecomers to the world, as though all the great science and civilization came from other people and we are just sitting at the table picking up the crumbs from the civilization of others. This is the main thesis of Diop, not just the beginnings of man, but the beginnings of civilization, because his contention that Egypt was African is not only proven by a great range of things, but it is critical because it shows that European civilization would not have been possible. The Greek miracles would not have been possible without the contribution of the Egyptian. Every major Greek scientist went to Africa, or some of them who didn't get a chance to go claim they went so as to give legitimacy to their scholarship. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus, Heraclitus, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. There's a whole list of them. One Greek scholar said you could fill a whole book up with the names of the Greeks who went to study in Africa. Every major development came out of that African world. The Europeans developed certain things, yes, they refined certain things, they defeated the Africans and were able to take things over. But when you look at the medicine of early Africa, you are amazed at the developments and sophistication. They produced many medical treatises, 10 of which survive in spite of the massive destruction of books. 10 medical treatises survive in Africa. 2 of them are very famous, the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, named after the people who stole them. And parts of that survive in the New York Museum, one of the medical museums in New York. I think it's the New York School of Medicine. They have chapters. Listen to this. Those two manuscripts, the Ebers and Edwin Smith, are 2,600 years before Christ and 1,500 years before Christ. And the one that is 1,500 years before Christ, which is 3,500 years ago, has chapters on helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy, diagnosis, treatment of abscesses and burns, diagnostic percussion, studies of the pulse, notes on circulation, 3,500 years ago. These are our ancestors writing books about that 3,500 years ago. Yet you hear about the father of modern medicine is Hippocrates. When even his theory of harmony and opposites comes out of the Egyptians, you hear about the great geometry of the Greeks. Geometry was created by the Africans along the Nile. They had to create geometry in order to deal with the fluctuations in the Nile tides. Pythagoras spent 22 years. I put it at 7 because I'm conservative. Even the greatest of European scientists stated that Pythagoras spent 22 years among the Egyptians, and the greatest of European scientists pointed out that we owe the Africans 3 things. He said the Africans developed the first atomic theory in Egypt. They call atoms monads. Now they hadn't reached the stage we've reached today, atomic fission or anything like that. But do you know what it is to be aware of atoms as the building block of the universe? The atom has to be magnified 1 billion times for you to see it. And yet they were talking about these monads, these unseen, invisible things that were the building block of the universe. Isaac Newton, the greatest of European scientists before Einstein, said that the Africans had a heliocentric theory of the solar system. That was not true in Europe. Europe believed the earth was the center, not the sun. That is why the Egyptians worshipped the sun. They saw the sun as a center and the earth and other planets revolve. They hadn't found all 9. They'd found about 5, but they saw it revolving around the sun. He also pointed out that they were the first to have ideas about gravity. They developed this business about the harmony of the spheres, these orbits moving in a certain order, having a certain harmony. These are new to Europe. We take all this for granted because all knowledge now comes from Europe. All books are made in Europe. All the teachers are in Europe. All those who get degrees and so forth, you have to go to Europe. So we have assumed that all this began there. It didn't begin there. The Greeks had to go to Crete as well as to Egypt, and Crete has been established both by Schliemann and Evans as largely an African civilization. And that long precedes the flowering of the Greek thing. Even the gods. You know how many of the gods and goddesses of Greece are black? And Tommy talk about the goddesses. Artemis, the goddess of chastity, is black woman. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, is a black woman. Circe is represented in Grecian vases as a black woman. She is the temptress in the Odyssey that turns Odysseus' crew into pigs. Jason, searching for the golden fleece, the great hero of the Greek legend, is helped by Medea, who is considered to be a black princess. Europe is named after an African princess, Europa. Most people think Africa is named by Europe. That's not true. Africa comes from Afro-Ika, which means birthplace. It's an Egyptian word. So that the profound influence not just on the science, in terms of mathematics, and in terms of medicine, in terms of these things, but in even philosophical concepts, religious ideas were carried over from Egypt, the seat of African civilization. When I say the seat, Egypt would not have been possible without all the things streaming from the cradle land of Africa, because Egypt is not the beginning of African civilization. They have found Tarseti in the Sudan, Kustal on the edge of the Sudan, which has kings, 12 black kings reigning 2 centuries before the first Egyptian dynasty, and all the elements that are later to appear in Egypt are already set down at Tarseti. Even the hieroglyphs The world's first major writing system. Other people have developed writing systems, the Sumerian, but nothing was as highly developed as the hieroglyphic system. It was to affect a lot of people, including the Europeans. Europeans have very few writing systems. There are very few Europeans who had writing systems. The French do not have a writing system. The English do not have a writing system. The Spanish do not have a writing system. Only the Romans and the Greeks and the Russians and the Phoenicians. There are only a few people with writing systems, about half a dozen in Europe. You take for granted everybody wrote. When the Romans conquered the English, they were utterly illiterate. They had never written a line. Yet when I was at university in England, they're talking about Africans are preliterate. They have a part missing in the brain. They're preliterate. That is not a highly developed part. And they're bloody preliterate, so that Cicero, the Roman, had to say, when they conquered the British, they are so stupid. I am quoting his exact word. They are so ignorant. I am not sure we can even make them into good slaves. And in Africa, you have the Manding script, you have the Akan, this is pre-European, Akan script, the Manding script, the Afaka script, the Meroitic script, the hieroglyphic script. There are several scripts in Africa. You say, well, okay, if the Africans had scripts, why didn't they write books? The earliest books in medicine are African. The earliest books in mathematics are African. And they're now saying, now it's becoming more and more clear that early Egypt, classical Egypt was African. People like Nugabor and other mathematicians are saying, yes. So the Africans did a few things, but they did not develop theoretical mathematics. They developed a sort of practical mathematics. The mathematics, they said, of empirical recipes. They learned from trial and error, but they didn't have a theoretical mathematics. Theoretical mathematics, theoretical abstract science begins with the Europeans, the Greeks. Do you know they actually programmed the computer in this country in 1967 to test that theory? And the computer discovered that of 22,295 possible decompositions, the early Egyptians had chosen the 46 most elegant and simple equations, which is what the computer would have chosen. Developed 4,000 years later, that is the absolute proof of a theoretical science. Because they weren't guessing. They couldn't have gone through all those possible computations to develop their structures. Geometry, which was borrowed from them, arithmetic was borrowed from them, their algebra hadn't gone very far. They had developed certain quantities in algebra. The Arabs during the Moorish period would carry algebra much further, but the Europeans didn't have algebra. It came from Al-Jabari and it came up into Europe. Europe was to feed heavily, very heavily, upon the work of Africans and Arabs, because there are 4 Moorish dynasties, and those dynasties, the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Almoravid and the Almohade dynasty fed Europe. When the Moors, most of them of which were black, some of them were pale-skinned types, because the Arabs included both black types and pale-skinned types, and some blacks came as Senegalese types, some came as Arabs, some came in as Berbers. You have both fair skin and black Berbers, but the majority were black. I know that because the pictures, when you read African Presence in Our Europe, you must purchase that book. That is an absolutely necessary book, because that shows you a range of things, and it shows you the pictorial evidence. One thing missing from that book, which I only discovered later, I was going to a scientific island in this country. It's called Plum Island. It's a place that deals with agricultural diseases, exotic diseases. And while I was on the boat taking me to this island with these scientists, somebody brought out a book on the Moors and started showing me the architecture. And I said, that's fine, but I'm interested in the people. Who are the Moors? There were no people, you know. Just one picture people. You know what that picture was? The only picture that showed Africans. The others didn't show people. The Africans surrendering So how could they surrender if they weren't in power? What did they surrender? And suppose this country had to surrender to Russia, is the blacks going to surrender, or Reagan's people? If we are not in power, how could we surrender the country? There are the blacks in the Almohade dynasty in 1492 surrendering Granada to the Spanish. Now they got them at last because they're in a lowly position, they're surrendering. But how could they surrender if they weren't in power? How could you surrender a major part of Spain if you're not in charge? What are you surrendering? I found that in books by the English, like one by Charlotte Young. There were no Africans, all the Moors were fair-skinned and blue-eyed. But the moment they started to defeat them, they turned black. The battlefield was littered with Africans. Where did these Africans come from? They just come to be defeated? Diop has had to fight this nonsense for many years. And I want to say a few things that he said about America when he came here. This is when he was speaking the first day on April the 4th, 1985, in the chapel dedicated to Dr. King. I have come to America to meet with those who are members of my family, that is to say, with you all. In fact, I am convinced that my family has been divided in two, and that half of it is here before me now. Just as you Americans who go to Africa feel that you're making a pilgrimage to the lands of your ancestors, I too am making a pilgrimage here in America. The most important thing that we have to do by the end of this century is to reconstruct the links that tie us as communities. I subscribe to the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. wholeheartedly. They are teachings that are aimed at unifying and reuniting kindred peoples. What I have to say here today is to reinforce the links that unite us and all people across the world. And then when he got back to Senegal just before he died, Dr. Finch went to interview him to ask him his impressions of America, and he said, I was very impressed by my contact with the black American community and with Americans in general. I discovered many things of which I was totally ignorant. As I said in the United States, I feel very strongly that this was a sort of pilgrimage for me. I think that all thinking Africans who go to America are in one way or another on a pilgrimage. I said before I left that I was going to find half of my family in America. It was just that. We are beginning to feel in a most vital way this biological kinship which ties us to America. The umbilical cord has not been cut, and this is very important. These relations must become much closer in the future. I believe that all of what lies in our common future is in this perspective. America is uniquely brought closer to Africa by historical ties. I was especially aware of this on American soil. And I want to end now by quoting the end of my editorial on this. On this American soil, on this side or plane of time, we shall not meet again, Cheikh Anta. But we have gathered the leaves of this work together because of your presiding spirit, because of the essence and purpose of your work. It is our duty to continue what you have begun, since we knew one day we would be forced to continue without your physical presence. Your spirit, after all, is the catalyst. And even if the wings upon which your body flew are broken, that spirit has already flown to us. It shall reside with us. It shall be enthroned in the hearts of your people always. And I end with this poem, too soon, the banner draped for you. I would prefer a banner in the wind, not bound so tightly with a scarlet fold, not sodden with your people's tears, but borne aloft, down and beyond this dark, dark lane of rags. Dear comrade, if it must be that I no longer speak with you, no longer walk with you, no longer march with you, then I must take a patience and a calm, for even now a greener leaf explodes, sun brightens stone, and all the river